My name is Doran Whelk. I am 41 years old. For one season from April through the end of August, I worked as the overnight security contractor at Marrow Hollow Family Park, a closed amusement park on the south end of a county that does not really want to admit it owns the property. I am not going to tell you which county. I will tell you that the park shut down in the autumn of 2003, that none of its 11 rides were ever dismantled, and that at 4 in the morning, on certain nights in the summer, every single one of them runs by itself. I logged in. That was my job. To watch and to write a sentence in a binder and to not count what I saw in the seats. I was hired through a staffing firm called Brennard Holdings, the kind of company that does not have a website you can find, only a phone number that rings to a woman named Patricia, who never gives her last name. Patricia called me on a Thursday afternoon in early April. She told me she had my resume from a previous overnight job at a self-storage facility and asked if I would be willing to do 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, at a closed property where the duties were, in her words, primarily observational. The pay was almost double what I had been making. There was no interview. There was a background check, but it was the short kind, the kind that only confirms you are not actively wanted somewhere. Patricia mailed me a key fob, a laminated site map, and a 1-page document titled Operational Expectations that I assumed at the time was a standard list of rules. I will come back to that document. I want to be honest about why I took the job. I had been divorced for 2 years. My daughter Lena was living with her mother 3 states away, and the only thing I was paying for was a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner that smelled like steam and chemical starch around the clock. I did not have hobbies. I did not have anyone waiting for me to come home. A job that paid me to sit alone in the dark for 12 hours sounded, frankly, like a vacation. I tell you this so you understand that I went into Marrow Hollow without any romantic ideas about it. I was not looking for ghosts. I was looking for quiet. The park itself is set back about a 1/4 mile from the road, behind a stand of pine and a chain-link fence with green plastic slats threaded through it so you cannot see in from the highway. The main gate is a tall arch of welded steel that used to have the park's name across the top in cursive neon. But the letters were removed at some point, and now the arch is just a curve of rust with empty mounting brackets. Inside the gate, the parking lot is cracked and weedy, with white lines you can still barely see if the moon is in the right place. There is a small ticket booth, a guard shack, and beyond those, the park. I want to describe the park to you carefully, because it matters. There were originally 11 attractions. A wooden roller coaster called the Hollow Howler, which is the largest structure on the property and still visible from the road if you know where to look. A steel kiddie coaster called the Acorn Run. A carousel with 36 horses, 2 swans, and 1 rabbit. A Ferris wheel, 80 feet tall with 16 gondolas. A swing carousel, the kind where the chairs fan out on chains. A spinning teacup ride. A small dark ride called Captain Cobble's Sea Voyage that ran on a water track. A bumper car pavilion. A train, a real narrow-gauge train, did a slow loop around the back third of the park. A log flume called Beaver Creek Splash. And at the very center of everything, a tall pendulum ride called the Pendulum of Marrow, which was the park's signature attraction, and the reason, according to old promotional postcards I later found in a drawer, that anyone drove out there in the first place. All of these rides are still present. None of them have been dismantled. The park was not closed because it was unprofitable, exactly. It was closed because the parent company decided to centralize its parks closer to the interstate, and Marrow Hollow was too far inland to justify operating. The rides were left in place because dismantling them costs money, and the property has been in legal dispute for over 2 decades. There are 7 parties with some kind of claim on the land, and none of them want to be the one who pays for demolition. So the rides sit. They are inspected once a year by a structural engineer who, I am told, drives in, walks the perimeter, photographs each attraction from a distance, signs a form, and leaves. He does not turn anything on. He does not climb anything. He files the form with the county and goes home. My job, as Patricia explained it to me on the phone, was to drive the loop road inside the park twice per shift, check that the perimeter fence had no breaches, log the readings from 4 electrical panels mounted at the bases of 4 of the rides, and report any unauthorized persons on the property to a number she would give me. I was not to enter any of the ride structures. I was not able to climb anything. I was not able to operate any equipment. I was, she said, a witness, not a worker. Those were her exact words, a witness, not a worker. The one-page document she sent me, the operational expectations, contained 8 numbered items. Most of them were unsurprising. Wear closed-toe shoes. Carry the company radio at all times. Do not consume alcohol on the property. Do not bring guests. Do not bring personal recording devices, including phones, into the patrol cart or onto the loop road. Things you would mostly expect for a contracted overnight post. But 3 of the items struck me as odd, and I read them several times in the car before my first shift. Item 4 read, "Electrical panel readings must be logged at 10 p.m. and again at 4 a.m. Do not log at other times. Do not estimate. If a panel cannot be read, record the panel number and the reason." Item 6 read, "If you observe lights, sounds, or motion from any attraction during your shift, do not approach the attraction. Complete your route as scheduled. Note the observation in the shift log using the standardized phrasing on the back of this page." Item 7 read, "Do not count." That was the entire item. 3 words. Do not count. There was no explanation, no clarification, no indication of what I was not supposed to count. I assumed it was a typo, or an in-joke between Patricia and whoever had written the document, or a reference to something I would learn on the job. The back of the page had the standardized phrasing for the observation log, which I will get to in a moment. Item 7 was not explained anywhere. My first shift was on a Wednesday in April. I arrived at the gate at 7 in the evening, used my fob to open the side door of the guard shack, and found my predecessor's setup more or less intact. A folding chair, a small desk, a binder, a coffee maker with a stained pot, a wall-mounted radio charger, a key locker, and a corkboard with a sun-faded map of the park pinned to it. There was no computer. The shift log was paper. The binder was labeled Whelk in fresh marker on the spine, which told me someone had been in here recently to swap it for me. The previous binder was nowhere in the shack. I assumed it had been archived somewhere, and I did not think about it again for several weeks. The shift itself was uneventful. I made my first loop at 9, my second at 1 in the morning. I read the 4 electrical panels at the correct times. I logged nothing under observations. I drank bad coffee. I listened to the radio occasionally to make sure it was working. And the only voice I heard was a woman dispatcher at some other site asking someone named Carl to confirm a perimeter check. Carl confirmed. The radio went quiet. At 7 in the morning, I locked the shack, drove home, and slept. The first 2 weeks were genuinely uneventful, and I do not want to pad this account with shifts where nothing happened. What I can tell you is that the routine settled into me the way that night shift routines do. By the start of my 3rd week, I knew the 4 panels. I knew where the loose paving stones were on the loop road. I knew which floodlight on the perimeter was wired wrong and flickered for the first 10 minutes after I turned it on. I knew the way the wooden coaster creaked in even a light wind, a slow, regular sound like a ship's rigging. I had stopped being nervous in the park, and I had started, in a small way, to enjoy it. The quiet was real. The air smelled like pine and old grease. The stars over the Ferris wheel were very clear. The first thing I want to tell you about happened on the night of May 9th. I remember the date because I had just paid my rent and the receipt was in my back pocket. I was on my 1 a.m. loop, driving the little electric utility cart Brennard had left for me, and I had just rounded the back of the bumper car pavilion when I noticed that the carousel was lit. Not all of it. 3 of the small bulbs along its outer canopy were on, faintly, the way a string of Christmas lights looks when only a few of the bulbs are still working. I stopped the cart. I sat there with the headlights pointed at the carousel, and I watched the bulbs. The carousel was not turning. There was no music. The horses were where the horses always were. But 3 bulbs, evenly spaced, about a third of the way around the canopy, were producing a low, warm glow. I remembered item 6. Do not approach. Complete the route as scheduled. Note the observation. I did all of those things. I finished my loop. I returned to the shack. I opened the binder and turned to the back of the operational expectations page, which had the standardized phrasing I was supposed to use. The phrasing was this: at the listed time during routine patrol, illumination was observed at the named attraction. No personnel were present. Observation logged per protocol. That was it. No lights came on. Not the ride activated. Illumination was observed. Passive voice. No cause. No description of how many bulbs or which ones or for how long. Just illumination was observed. I wrote it out exactly as instructed. At 1:14 a.m., during routine patrol, illumination was observed at the carousel. No personnel were present. Observation logged per protocol. I sat with the binder open for a long time after that. The phrasing bothered me. It bothered me because it sounded like something written by a lawyer, or by someone who had been told very clearly that whatever was being logged was not to be characterized, not to be quantified, not to be interpreted, just noted, just witnessed. A witness, not a worker. I considered calling Patricia. It was the middle of the night. I did not call. The next morning I drove the loop one more time before locking up, partly out of curiosity and partly because the sun was up, and I wanted to look at the carousel in daylight. The bulbs were off. The carousel was the same as it had always been. The horses had not moved. There was no scuff in the dust on the platform, no footprints, no sign that anything had been near it. I looked at the electrical panel that controlled the carousel, which is panel 3 on my route, and the breaker was in the off position, as it had been every night since I started. I drove home. I slept. I did not think about it for 2 days, because 2 days is how long it takes me to convince myself that something I saw was probably nothing. The second thing I want to tell you about happened 9 nights later, on May 18th. I was at the desk in the shack, finishing my 11 o'clock coffee, when I heard music. It was not loud. It was faint, almost like a radio in another room, and at first I assumed my own radio had drifted off its channel. But the song was wrong for that. It was not a song from any station around here. It was an organ piece, the kind of march a carousel plays, in that thin metallic timbre that old band organs have, with the slight wobble of a cylinder that has not been tuned in a long time. I stepped out of the shack. The music was coming from the direction of the carousel. I could not see the carousel from the shack, because the ticket booth was in the way, but the sound was unmistakably from that quadrant of the park. I followed item 6. I did not approach. I got into the cart. I drove the route. When the route brought me past the carousel, I slowed down but did not stop. The carousel was lit. Not 3 bulbs this time. All of them. The full canopy was glowing a warm yellow, and the carousel was turning slowly at what I would estimate was a child's ride speed, maybe 2 revolutions per minute. The horses were rising and falling on their poles. The 2 swans were rising and falling. The rabbit was rising and falling. The band organ was playing. There was no one on the carousel. The horses were empty. The swans were empty. The rabbit was empty. I want to be very clear about what I did not do. I did not stop the cart. I did not get out. I did not approach. I did not try to photograph the carousel, because my phone was locked in the shack as the rules required. I completed the loop. I returned to the shack. I opened the binder. I wrote, at 11:42 p.m., during routine patrol, illumination and motion were observed at the carousel. No personnel were present. Observation logged per protocol. Then I sat at the desk, and I listened. The music continued for another 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock. At 11:53, the music stopped. I drove the route again at 1 in the morning, as required. The carousel was dark. The horses were where the horses always were. I called Patricia in the morning. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had seen. I told her I had followed item 6 exactly. There was a silence on the line that lasted maybe 4 seconds, and then she said, "Thank you for logging it correctly, Doran." "That's what the log is for." I said, "Patricia, the carousel was running, with no power." She said, "The log is what we need. Please continue your shifts as scheduled." I said, "Are you telling me this is normal?" She said, "I'm telling you that you logged it correctly." She hung up. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, and I understood, in a quiet way, that I had taken a job at a place where the carousel sometimes ran by itself, and that my job was specifically not to do anything about it. I was being paid to write a sentence in a binder. I had been told this from the beginning, a witness, not a worker. I want to tell you that I quit. I want to tell you that I called Patricia back and told her to find someone else. But I did not. I will be honest with you about why. The money was good, the work was easy, and I had spent 2 years in a small apartment above a dry cleaner with nothing to do. And the strangeness of the park was, at first, a kind of company. Something was happening at Marrow Hollow. I did not know what it was, but it was happening on my shift. and on no one else's, and that gave me a small, unfamiliar feeling of importance. That feeling did not last. Over the next several weeks, the observations increased in frequency. I want to walk you through them carefully, because the pattern matters. On May 24th, the Ferris wheel rotated through exactly one full revolution, between 2 and 3 in the morning. I observed it from the loop road. The gondolas were empty. The music was not playing. The wheel turned once, smoothly, and stopped in the same position it had started in. I logged in. On May 29th, the bumper car pavilion lit up from the inside. The floor lights came on. The wire mesh ceiling that delivers power to the cars hummed faintly, and 3 of the cars rolled slowly across the floor without drivers, bumped each other gently, and stopped. The lights went off. I logged in. On June 2nd, the spinning teacup ride spun. One teacup, just one, the blue one. The other teacups remained still. The ride's central platform did not rotate. Only that single teacup spun in place slowly for about 4 minutes. I logged in. On June 6th, the swing carousel raised its chairs. The central tower turned, the chairs lifted on their chains to about 2/3 height, hung there for what I would estimate was 30 seconds, and lowered back down. There was no wind. The chairs were empty. I logged in. I want to draw your attention to 2 things about these observations. The first is that each ride activated only once during the period I observed it, and each ride activated only after I'd passed it on a previous loop without incident. It was as though the rides were waiting for me to be elsewhere before they ran. I never caught a ride starting. I only caught it running briefly, and then stopping. The second is that the rides were activated in an order. I did not notice this until I was halfway through June, when I sat down with my logs and arranged them by date. Carousel, May 9th. Carousel, May 18th. Ferris wheel, May 24th. Bumper cars, May 29th. Teacups, June 2nd. Swing carousel, June 6th. The interval was shortening, and the rides were activating in a sequence that traced, on the park map, a slow inward spiral. From the carousel near the front, to the Ferris wheel slightly deeper, to the bumper cars, to the teacups, to the swing carousel, each attraction one step closer to the center of the park. The center of the park was the Pendulum of Marrow. I am going to tell you about the binder now, because the binder is where I started to understand what I was actually working at. I mentioned that my predecessor's binder had been removed from the shack before I arrived. What I did not realize until June was that there was a second locker in the shack, behind the coffee maker, low to the floor, with a faded yellow tag on it that read Archive. I had assumed it was for storage. The key for it was not on my keyring, but the lock was old, and one night, after a particularly long loop, I sat down with a flathead screwdriver, and I worked the lock until it gave. I want to be honest. I knew this was outside my authority. I did not care anymore. I wanted to know what I was logging. Inside the locker were 11 binders. Each one had a name on the spine in marker. The names were all different. Some of the binders were thin, some were thick. The oldest binder had a date on the inside cover of October 2003, which is the month the park officially closed. The most recent binder, before mine, had a date of the previous October, and the name on the spine was Aldrin. I read Aldrin's binder first. His handwriting was small and careful. His logs were almost entirely the standardized phrasing. Illumination was observed at the carousel. Motion was observed at the Ferris wheel. Illumination and motion were observed at the bumper car pavilion. The same 6 rides I had been logging, in roughly the same order, working inward through the spring and summer of the previous year. His binder ended in mid-September. The last entry was dated September 11th. It read, at 3:48 a.m. during routine patrol, illumination and motion were observed at the Pendulum of Marrow. Passenger count was observed. Observation logged per protocol. Passenger count was observed. That phrase was not on the back of my operational expectations page. It was not part of any standardized phrasing I had been given. Aldrin had written it himself. And below it, in smaller handwriting, almost a scribble, he had added a single line that was clearly not part of any protocol. The line read, "It was not empty this time." There were no further entries in his binder. The next page was blank. The page after that was blank. The binder ended. I sat on the floor of the shack with Aldrin's binder open on my lap, and I went back to the locker, and I pulled out the next binder in the stack. It was labeled HOSCH. The handwriting was different, looser, and the binder was thinner. Hosh's logs ran from the spring of 2 years prior to the late summer of 2 years prior. The same 6 rides, the same order, the same inward spiral. His last entry was dated August 28th. It read, "At 2:11 a.m. during routine patrol, illumination and motion were observed at the Pendulum of Marrow. The car was occupied. Observation logged per protocol. The car was occupied. I pulled the next binder. Ferris, the same pattern. Spring through late summer, 6 rides, inward spiral. His last entry, dated August 14th of 3 years prior, read at 4:02 a.m. during routine patrol, illumination and motion were observed at the Pendulum of Marrow. A passenger was present. Observation logged per protocol. I pulled the next. Kratz, the same. I pulled the next. Enwald, the same. I went through all 11 binders. Every single guard, going back to 2003, had logged the same sequence of 6 rides during the spring and summer in the same inward spiral, ending at the Pendulum of Marrow. Every single guard had made a final entry at the pendulum, and every single guard's final entry had noted in some form that the pendulum's car had a passenger. The exact phrasing varied. A figure was seated. The seat was filled. The car carried one. The pendulum was not empty. After the final entry, in every binder, the pages went blank. No guard had ever written a log entry after observing a passenger on the pendulum. I want to be careful about what I am saying. I am not saying that those guards died. I do not know what happened to them. I never met any of them. Patricia never spoke any of their names to me. The binders simply ended, and a new binder began the following spring with a new name. There was no overlap. There was no transition shift. There was no handoff. Each guard worked alone for 1 season, from spring until late summer, and then the binder ended and a new one started months later in the spring. 11 binders, 11 guards, 23 years. I want to mention item 7 again. Do not count. I had counted the binders. I had counted the names. I had counted the years. I did not yet know what I had broken. I closed the locker. I put Aldrin's binder back on top of the stack where I had found it. I locked the locker as best I could with the damaged mechanism. I went out to the cart and I drove my 1 a.m. loop. The park was quiet. Nothing was illuminated. Nothing was in motion. The night was warm and the wooden coaster creaked softly in the wind. When I came back around to the central plaza, the Pendulum of Marrow was lit. The pendulum is a tall A-frame, maybe 70 feet at the apex, with a long arm that swings a single open-air car at the bottom. The car holds 16 passengers, 8 to a side, in 2 rows facing each other. The car was suspended at the lowest point of its arc, motionless, but the floodlights on the A-frame were on, and the small marquee at the base of the structure, which I had never seen lit, was glowing. The marquee read, "The Pendulum of Marrow," in white letters on a red field, and below that, in smaller letters, "Next ride at," and then a digital readout, the kind that flips like an old train station display showing a time. The time on the readout was 4 a.m. It was 1:17. I sat in the cart with the headlights pointed at the pendulum, and I watched the readout. It did not change. 4 a.m. 2 hours and 43 minutes from now. I did the math several times to make sure. Item 6, do not approach. Complete the route as scheduled. Note the observation. I completed the route. I returned to the shack. I opened my binder. My hand was not steady, but I wrote the entry. At 1:17 a.m., during routine patrol, illumination was observed at the Pendulum of Marrow. No personnel were present. Observation logged per protocol. I did not write what the marquee said. I did not write the time on the readout. I did not know if I was supposed to. The standardized phrasing did not have a line for it. I sat at the desk, and I waited. The park was very quiet. The radio said nothing. I did not call Patricia. I did not know what I would have said. I am scheduled for a ride at 4. I am not the passenger. I do not know who it is. At 3 in the morning, I made my second loop. I read the 4 electrical panels. Panel 3, the carousel, was off. Panel 5, the Ferris wheel was off. Panel 7, the bumper cars was off. Panel 9, the pendulum was off. The breakers were all in the off position. Every panel was cold. No current was running through any of them. The pendulum's marquee was still glowing. I want you to understand this. The marquee had no power. The lights had no power. None of the rides that had activated in the last 2 months had drawn power from any panel I was responsible for. I had been logging the panel readings at 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. every night, and the readings had never changed. The rides ran on nothing. They ran on something that was not electricity. I went back to the shack. I sat at the desk. The clock said 3:21. The radio said nothing. I considered, for the first time since I had taken the job, getting in my car and driving home and not coming back. I will tell you why I did not. I had a key fob that opened the gate. I had a binder with my name on the spine. I had a folder on Patricia's desk, somewhere, with my address and my emergency contacts and my daughter's name on it. Because Lena was listed as my emergency contact, even though she was 12 years old and lived 3 states away with her mother. I had signed a contract that said I was a witness, not a worker. I had read 11 binders that ended at the Pendulum. I understood, sitting in that shack at 3:21, that if I left, the binder would simply close on my last entry, the way the others had closed, and the next spring, there would be a new binder with a new name on the spine, and the cycle would continue. I would be one of 11, I would be one of 12. I would be a stack in a locker that someone like me would jimmy open in 3 years and read by the light of a desk lamp. I do not know if I was thinking clearly. I was very tired. I'd been on shift for 8 hours, and I had just read every binder in that locker. I made a decision. I decided that I would not approach the Pendulum. I would complete my route as scheduled. I would log the observation using the standardized phrasing. I would not count. I would not write down the marquee time. I would not record what I had seen in the binders. I would not call Patricia. I would behave, for the rest of the shift, exactly the way the operational expectations document told me to behave. I would be a perfect witness. I held that decision for 38 minutes. At 3:59, the floodlights on every attraction in the park came on at once. The carousel, the acorn run, the Ferris wheel, the swing carousel, the teacups, the bumper cars, the dark ride, the train, the flume, the hollow howler, all of them, every bulb on every canopy, every spotlight on every A-frame. The park lit up like a postcard. From the shack window, through the gap between the ticket booth and the maintenance shed, I could see the Ferris wheel glowing white and gold against the black sky, and I could hear, from the center of the park, the band organ on the carousel starting up. And underneath the band organ, faintly, I could hear other things: the clatter of the wooden coaster's chain lift engaging, the hiss of the log flume's water valves opening, the distant whistle of the narrow-gauge train. Every ride was starting. I went outside. I want to be honest about this. I did not stay in the shack. I went outside, because I needed to see. And I walked to the edge of the parking lot, where I could look down the main path into the park. I did not get in the cart. I did not approach. I stood at the edge of the lot. The carousel was turning. The Ferris wheel was turning. The swing carousel's chairs were lifted to full extension and rotating slowly through the air. The teacups were spinning, all of them now, not just the blue one. The bumper cars were moving in their pavilion, weaving around each other in patterns that did not look random. The train was somewhere in the back of the park. I could hear it on the track, the slow chug of a small steam engine that, to my knowledge, had not had a fire in its boiler in 23 years. And the Pendulum of Marrow was swinging. The long arm was tracing slow arcs across the sky, the car at the end rising on one side and then the other, the marquee glowing red, and even from the parking lot, even at that distance, I could see that the car was full. I could see passengers. I could see the small dark shapes of heads, in 2 rows, 8 to a side, swinging back and forth. 16 of them. I could not see their faces. I do not want to tell you that I could see their faces because I could not. And I do not want to embellish this. I could see shapes. 16 shapes, in the seats, holding the safety bar, riding the pendulum at 4 in the morning in a closed amusement park that had no electrical power running to any of its attractions. The band organ was playing the same march it had played on May 18th. I recognized it now. I do not know the name of the piece. I know the melody. I stood at the edge of the lot for a long time. I do not know how long. The rides ran, the pendulum swung, the band organ played. At some point, and I cannot tell you when, the rides began to wind down, one by one. The bumper cars first, then the teacups, then the swing carousel, then the Ferris wheel. The carousel kept turning longer than the others, the band organ playing its march in the still air, until finally it slowed and stopped, and the music ended on an unfinished note, the way a music box stops when you stop winding it. The pendulum was the last. It swung lower and lower, its arcs shortening, until it came to rest at the bottom of its track. The marquee continued to glow. The car was empty. I want to say that again. The car was empty. The 16 shapes were gone. I do not know where they went. I did not see them disembark. I did not see them walk away. They were there, and then the pendulum stopped swinging, and they were not. The floodlights cut out, one section of the park at a time, in reverse order from how they had come on. The last lights to go off were the small bulbs on the carousel canopy. 3 of them lingered after the others, the same 3 that had been lit on May 9th. They glowed for a few seconds, dimmed, and went out. The park was dark again. The marquee on the pendulum was dark. The night was very quiet. A bird, somewhere in the pines, made a single short call. I looked at my watch. It was 4:23. I walked back to the shack. I sat at the desk. I opened my binder. I wrote. At 4 a.m. during routine patrol, illumination and motion were observed at multiple attractions. No personnel were present. Observation logged per protocol. I did not write about the passengers. I did not write that I had counted them. I did not write that I had not counted them either, because I had, sitting in the parking lot in the cold. And I had not been able to stop counting, because there is a specific physical compulsion to count things when you see them in a row. And I had counted 16 twice before I had made myself stop. At 7 in the morning I locked the shack. I drove home. I slept badly. In the late afternoon I woke up, and I sat at my kitchen table and I drank coffee and I tried to think clearly about what had happened, but I could not, and finally, I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Patricia, I need to ask you something." She said, "Yes, Doran." I said, "What happens at the end of the season?" There was a pause. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The binders end in the summer. Every binder I have ever seen ends in August or September. What happens to the guards after that?" A longer pause this time. She said, "Doran, what binders are you referring to?" I said nothing. She said, "Doran, I need you to understand that the archive is not part of your assignment. The archive is not for current personnel. If you have been in the archive locker, that is a violation of your contract." I said, "Patricia, I saw the pendulum running last night, with passengers." She said, very calmly, "Did you log it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Using the standardized phrasing?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you have done your job. Please continue your shifts as scheduled. Please do not return to the archive." She hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I want to tell you what I understood, in that quiet kitchen, with my cooling coffee in front of me. I understood that Patricia knew. I understood that whoever had written the operational expectations document had known. I understood that the binders in the archive locker were not forgotten. They were filed. They were preserved. They were waiting for the next guard to break the lock and read them, exactly the way I had. I understood that item 7, do not count, was not about the bulbs on the carousel, or the gondolas on the Ferris wheel, or the horses on the carousel, or the cars in the bumper pavilion. It was about the passengers. The passengers I had counted on the pendulum. I understood that the rides did not need passengers in the way that a working ride needs passengers, the way that a business needs paying customers. The rides needed passengers in the way that a system needs a quantity to be fulfilled, the way a manifest needs 16 names. The pendulum had been the destination all along, and the other rides, the carousel and the Ferris wheel, and the bumper cars and the teacups and the swing carousel, had been the boarding sequence, each one a station, each one a step closer to the seat at the center. 16 passengers had ridden the pendulum at 4 in the morning. I do not know who they were. I do not know if they were the same passengers every year. I do not know if the ride is a delivery or a punishment or a habit or something else. I do not know if it ends or if it just continues. The binders only show me 23 years. The park has been closed for 23 years. I do not know what the park was doing before it closed. I worked the rest of the season. I owe you the honest ending, so I will tell you that plainly. I worked through July and into August. I drove my loops. I read my panels at 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. I logged illumination and motion at various attractions, none of them inside the central spiral, because the spiral had completed, and the rides outside it, the dark ride and the train and the log flume and the wooden coaster and the kiddie coaster, began their own slow inward sequence, a second spiral, a second boarding. I logged them. I used the standardized phrasing. I did not count. I did not look at the pendulum's marquee. I did not return to the archive locker. I did what Patricia told me to do. I was a perfect witness. On August 29th, on what I knew, by then, would be one of my last shifts, the pendulum lit up again at 1 in the morning. The marquee glowed. The readout said 4 a.m. I did not approach. I completed my route. I returned to the shack. I sat at the desk. I waited. At 4 a.m., the floodlights came on across the park, and the ride started, and the band organ played, and the pendulum swung, and I did not go outside. I stayed in the shack. I sat with my back to the window. I did not count. I did not look. At 4:23, the park went dark. I logged the observation using the standardized phrasing. I did not write about the passengers. I did not know if there had been 16 this time. I did not know if there had been 17. I did not look. I finished my shift. I drove home. The following Thursday, Patricia called. She said the season was ending, and that Bernard would be in touch in the spring about the next contract. She thanked me for my service. She said my work had been satisfactory. She said the binder would be archived. She did not ask me about anything I'd seen. She did not mention the pendulum. She did not mention the archive locker. She did not mention item 7. I asked her one question. I asked her if the guard who started in the spring would be someone new, or whether I would be offered the contract again. She said, "We rotate, Doran. We always rotate. Your name will be considered in the spring." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means your name will be considered in the spring." She hung up. I am telling you this in the middle of February. The park is closed for the off-season, which is to say it is closed in the way it is always closed. The gates locked, the ride still, the floodlights off. I do not know if anything runs there in the winter. I do not know if the pendulum lights its marquee on cold January nights with no one to log it. I assume not. I assume the system is seasonal, the way the park was seasonal when it was open, and that the riders sleep through the winter and wake up in the spring. I have not heard from Patricia. I have not been offered the contract for the new season. I do not know if I will be, and I will tell you honestly that I am not afraid of being offered the job again. I am afraid of not being offered it. I am afraid that my name has been considered, and a decision has been made, and that the decision was that I logged correctly, but I counted, and that counting disqualifies me from the witness role, and that I have, by counting, moved myself from one column on the manifest to another. Last week, on a Tuesday night, I was lying in bed at 2 in the morning, and I heard faintly, through my apartment, the sound of a band organ, the same march, the same metallic timbre, the same wobble. I got up. I went to the bedroom window. I opened it. I listened. The sound was not coming from outside. It was coming from inside the apartment. It was very quiet. It was coming, as far as I could tell, from the wall behind my dresser, where there is no vent, no pipe, and no shared wall with any neighbor, because my apartment is on the corner of the building. I stood in the dark, and I listened to the band organ play its march, all the way through, the same unfinished note at the end, where the music box stops when you stop winding it. Then the apartment was quiet. I have heard it on 3 other nights since, always around 2 in the morning, always the same march, always from the wall behind the dresser, always ending on the same unfinished note. I have not moved the dresser. I have not put my ear to the wall. I am trying to be a witness now. Just a witness, not a worker. The marquee in the center of the park is glowing tonight. I do not have to see it to know. I logged it for 1 full season. I know what it looks like. It is glowing red, and the readout under it is showing a time, and the time is 4 a.m. Somewhere on a manifest, in a folder, on a desk, in an office, in a city I do not know, my name has been considered. Either way, the ride is scheduled. Either way, the seats will be full.